The night that changed my fear. Have you ever wanted to quit learning English, not because you are lazy, but because you feel tired, embarrassed, and a little lost? I remember one cold evening during my first year living in the United States. I was sitting alone in my small apartment after work. Outside the window, the wind was moving the trees slowly, and the city felt strangely quiet. That night, I almost gave up. Not just English, but the whole idea of building a new life here. You see, moving to America sounds exciting when people talk about it. New opportunities. New culture. New life. But the part people rarely talk about is the silence. The silence when people speak too fast and you cannot follow. The silence when everyone laughs at a joke, and you are still trying to understand the first sentence. And the silence when you begin to wonder if you will ever feel comfortable speaking again. Maybe you know this feeling. Maybe you have opened an English video many times, and closed it after 5 minutes. Maybe you thought, my English is not good enough. I felt that too. But something unexpected happened the next weekend. A friend from work invited me on a camping trip. Now, I need to tell you something honestly. At that time, I was afraid of 2 things. First, speaking English with people for a long time. Second, sleeping in the middle of a forest. And that weekend, I was about to face both. I didn't know it yet, but that first camping trip in America would slowly change something inside me. Not in a dramatic movie way. Not overnight. But in a quiet, human way. The kind of change that begins with a small conversation, beside a campfire, under a sky full of stars. In this video, I want to share that story with you. A simple story. My first camping trip in the United States. How I felt scared. How I almost stayed home. And how, surprisingly, that trip helped me overcome one of my biggest fears. Not just the fear of the dark forest, but the fear of speaking English imperfectly. So today, let's take this journey together. Slow English. A real story. And maybe, somewhere in this story, you will see a little piece of your own journey too. The night I almost gave up. There was a quiet evening during my first year living in the United States when I seriously thought about giving up on learning English. Not forever, maybe. But at least for a while. The kind of break that slowly becomes permanent. It was late autumn. The air outside my apartment was cold, and the wind was moving slowly between the buildings. In many American cities, autumn has a very specific feeling. The trees turn orange and red, the sky becomes darker earlier, and people begin talking about winter, holidays, and long road trips. Inside my small apartment, everything felt unusually silent. I had just returned home from work. My job was simple, but it required listening carefully to coworkers, customers, and instructions throughout the day. For someone still learning English, that kind of listening can feel like running a mental marathon. Your brain keeps translating. Your ears keep guessing. And sometimes your confidence quietly disappears. I placed my bag on the chair, made a quick dinner, and sat at the small kitchen table near the window. The streetlight outside was shining through the glass, creating a soft yellow reflection on the table. Moments like this often become thinking moments. The kind where your mind starts asking uncomfortable questions. Earlier that day at work, a group of coworkers had been talking about their weekend plans. In the United States, many people love outdoor activities. Hiking, fishing, road trips, and especially camping. One coworker said, "We're going camping this weekend. The weather will be perfect." Another person laughed and replied, "Yeah, before winter comes." They were excited. Talking about lakes, forests, and cooking over a fire. Then someone turned to me. "So, have you ever been camping?" I paused for a second. Camping was something I had seen in movies. People sleeping in tents, sitting around a campfire, telling stories under a sky full of stars. But in my real life, I had never done anything like that. I smiled politely and answered slowly. Not yet. Maybe one day. The conversation continued, but something stayed in my mind. That simple question reminded me of how new my life still was in America. Back in my home country, weekends usually meant family meals, visiting relatives, or meeting friends in cafes. Life followed familiar routines. Here in the United States, weekends often meant adventure. Driving for hours. Exploring nature. Sleeping in places where there were no buildings, no city lights, sometimes not even phone signals. It sounded exciting. But also a little intimidating. After finishing dinner, I opened my laptop and searched for a slow English practice video. Watching English videos had become part of my daily routine. Many language experts recommend daily listening practice because it trains the brain to recognize natural rhythms of speech. The video started playing. A calm voice spoke slowly. I tried to focus on every word. For a few minutes, everything felt fine. Then the familiar struggle began. One sentence was easy. The next sentence moved too fast. My brain tried to translate while still listening to the next idea. Cognitive scientists often explain that language learners experience something called processing overload. The brain is working so hard to understand meaning that it becomes mentally exhausted much faster than normal listening. After about 5 minutes, I paused the video. Then replayed one part. Then paused again. Finally, I closed the laptop halfway. The room felt quiet again. That was when the difficult thought appeared. Maybe this is harder than expected. Moving to the United States had sounded exciting when I first imagined it. A new culture, new opportunities, new experiences. But living inside that dream sometimes felt different. There were small moments during the day that nobody warned you about. Moments when people speak quickly and you only understand part of the conversation. Moments when everyone laughs at a joke and you are still translating the first sentence. Moments when you want to share a story from your life but cannot find the right English words. These moments slowly create doubt. Not dramatic doubt. Quiet doubt. The kind that appears when the day becomes silent. While I was sitting there thinking, my phone vibrated on the table. A new message appeared. It was from one of the coworkers who had been talking about camping earlier. Hey. A few of us are going on a camping trip this weekend. You should come with us. I looked at the message longer than necessary. Camping. In the forest. With native English speakers. Sleeping in a tent. My brain quickly created a list of worries. What if I don't understand what people are saying? What if I say something wrong? What if I cannot sleep because the forest feels too strange? Psychologists say that the human brain often exaggerates unfamiliar situations. When something is new, the mind automatically imagines possible danger, even if the situation is safe. The forest suddenly felt very far outside my comfort zone. I started typing a reply. Then deleted it. Typed again. Paused. Finally, I wrote something simple. Sounds interesting. Let me think about it. I placed the phone down and walked toward the window. The night outside looked calm. The streetlights glowed softly, and the sky above the city felt wide and quiet. For a moment, I imagined something different. A dark forest instead of buildings. A warm campfire instead of electric lights. People sitting together under the stars, telling stories. Maybe speaking slowly. Maybe laughing. Maybe sharing simple conversations in English. Language researchers often say that the brain remembers emotional experiences better than traditional study. When learning connects with real-life situations, vocabulary and confidence grow naturally. At that moment, I did not realize it yet. But that small message on my phone was about to start a story that would change my confidence completely. A story about fear. About trying something uncomfortable. And about my first camping trip in the United States. Because sometimes the biggest changes in life begin with something very small. A quiet evening. A simple message. And one decision that feels slightly scary. The next morning, I finally sent my answer. My first months living in America. The first months of living in the United States felt a little like walking through a new city in the early morning fog. You can see the shapes of buildings. You can hear the sounds of life starting. But many details still feel unclear. That was exactly how my life felt when I first arrived. Everything looked exciting from the outside, but inside my mind there were many small questions waiting for answers. I still remember my first morning waking up in my apartment in America. The sunlight came through the window in a different way than back home. The streets were wider. The air felt cooler. Even the silence sounded different. Small details suddenly mattered. The sound of the coffee machine in the kitchen. The neighbor walking their dog early in the morning. The distant noise of cars moving slowly down the road. These simple things reminded me that I was living somewhere completely new. At first, I tried to treat everything like an adventure. Many people say that moving to a new country is one of the best ways to grow as a person. You learn independence. You learn patience. And most importantly, you learn how strong your mind can become. But the reality of daily life has its own rhythm. During the first few weeks, every task required extra attention. Going to the grocery store was no longer automatic. I needed to read labels carefully, understand different food names, and sometimes ask simple questions. One afternoon I stood in the bread aisle for almost 5 minutes. There were so many choices. Whole wheat. Multigrain. Sourdough. Organic. A friendly employee walked by and asked, "Need help finding something?" I replied slowly, trying to pronounce each word clearly. "I'm just looking for simple bread." The employee smiled and pointed to a shelf. "Classic white bread is right there." Moments like that were small victories. Not perfect English. But communication happened. Still, there were also challenging moments. At work, conversations moved quickly. Coworkers talked about sports, weekend plans, movies, and family events. Their voices overlapped, jokes appeared suddenly, and laughter filled the room. Sometimes I understood everything. Other times I caught only pieces. Language learning researchers often explain that the brain needs time to adjust to natural speed. Listening to real conversations requires recognizing tone, rhythm, and context all at once. In the beginning, that process feels overwhelming. Your brain works like a computer with too many programs open at the same time. Listening. Translating. Understanding emotion. Preparing a response. By the end of the day, my mind often felt exhausted. There was also another challenge many immigrants quietly experience, the feeling of distance. Not physical distance. Emotional distance. Back home, conversations flowed easily. Humor came naturally. Stories could be shared without hesitation. Here in America, I sometimes needed extra seconds just to organize my thoughts in English. Those seconds felt long. But slowly, I began noticing something interesting. Americans often appreciate effort more than perfection. One afternoon at work, I apologized to a coworker after struggling to explain something. "Sorry, my English is still slow," I said. My coworker laughed gently and replied, "Your English is fine. You're doing great." That simple sentence stayed with me. It reminded me that communication is not only about grammar. It is about connection. The more I listened to people around me, the more I noticed how relaxed everyday conversations could be. Not everyone speaks in perfect sentences. People pause. They repeat ideas. They laugh at mistakes. This realization slowly changed my mindset. Instead of trying to speak perfectly, I started focusing on speaking honestly. And that made a difference. In the evenings, I continued practicing English through stories and videos. Slow listening practice helped train my ears to recognize common phrases. Experts in language learning often recommend something called comprehensible input. This means listening to English that is slightly above your current level but still understandable. Over time, your brain naturally adapts. Words become familiar. Sentence patterns become predictable. Confidence grows. However, confidence rarely grows in a straight line. Some days felt encouraging. Other days felt discouraging. One rainy evening after work, I walked home thinking about the conversation from earlier that week, the one about camping. My coworkers had been so excited. They described forests, lakes, and quiet nights under the stars. Camping seemed like an important part of American outdoor culture. Many families and friends spend weekends exploring nature together. It is a way to relax, disconnect from busy cities, and reconnect with simple experiences. But for me, the idea of camping still felt intimidating. Two different fears were quietly competing inside my mind. The first fear was simple, nature itself. Sleeping in the middle of a forest sounded unfamiliar. Strange sounds. Darkness. No city lights. The second fear felt deeper. Spending 2 full days speaking English with people. No short conversations. No quick escapes. Just real interaction. At home that evening, I opened my phone and looked again at the message about the camping trip. Hey. A few of us are going on a camping trip this weekend. You should come with us. The message still waited there patiently. Part of me wanted to decline politely. Another part of me felt curious. Psychologists often explain that growth usually happens just outside the comfort zone. When we face small challenges, the brain slowly builds new confidence. Standing at that invisible border between comfort and curiosity can feel uncomfortable. But it can also lead to surprising moments. I placed the phone on the table and stared at it for a moment. Somewhere deep inside my mind, a quiet voice appeared. Maybe this is exactly the kind of experience you need. Not another video. Not another grammar lesson. A real experience. With real people. In real English. At that moment, I didn't know that one simple decision would soon take me far away from the city, deep into a quiet American forest. And that trip would begin a story I would remember for the rest of my life. The invitation that made me panic. The message about the camping trip stayed on my phone for 2 days. Not because the decision was complicated, but because my mind kept creating reasons to say no. If you have ever faced something unfamiliar, you probably understand this strange mental process. The brain begins to imagine every possible difficulty before the experience even begins. Psychologists call this anticipatory anxiety. It happens when the mind tries to protect you from uncertainty by predicting problems that may never actually happen. And my brain was very busy predicting problems. Camping meant leaving the city. That alone felt like a big step. I had grown used to buildings, streetlights, grocery stores, and reliable phone signals. The idea of sleeping somewhere surrounded by trees felt different. Very different. Then there was the second concern, speaking English for an entire weekend. Short conversations at work were manageable. I could listen carefully, respond slowly, and sometimes escape back to my tasks. But a camping trip meant hours of talking. Conversations during the drive. Conversations while setting up tents. Conversations around a campfire. The more I imagined the situation, the more nervous I felt. On Thursday afternoon, during lunch break, the coworker who sent the message walked over to my table. His name was Mark. Mark was the kind of person who always seemed relaxed. He laughed easily, spoke casually, and loved outdoor adventures. He sat down across from me and opened his lunchbox. "So," he said, smiling, "did you think about the camping trip?" I tried to hide my hesitation. "A little," I answered. Mark nodded. "It's going to be fun. Just a small group. Nothing complicated." My mind immediately imagined complicated things anyway. Wild animals. Cold nights. Difficult English conversations. Seeing my expression, Mark added something interesting. "Don't worry. First camping trips are always a little funny." "Funny?" I asked. He laughed. "Yeah. Everyone forgets something. Someone always brings too much food. And someone usually hears a noise in the forest and thinks it's a bear." The word bear did not help my confidence. Mark continued eating his sandwich and spoke casually about the plan. "We're leaving Saturday morning. Driving about 2 hours north. There's a lake in a small forest area. Great place for beginners." Beginners. That word caught my attention. Camping suddenly sounded slightly less intimidating. But my brain still had one more concern. English. I decided to be honest. "I'm still learning English," I said slowly. "Sometimes I understand slowly." Mark shrugged in a relaxed way. "That's fine. Nobody talks perfectly around a campfire anyway." He took a sip of water and added, "Actually, camping is probably one of the easiest places to talk." I looked confused. "Why?" Mark smiled. "Because nobody is in a hurry." That simple sentence stayed in my mind. Nobody is in a hurry. In cities, conversations often move quickly. People are busy. They jump between topics. Phones ring, cars pass by, and schedules push everything forward. But in nature, time moves differently. People slow down. They sit. They watch the fire. They talk. Sometimes slowly. Sometimes with long pauses. For someone learning English, that kind of environment might actually be easier. Later that evening, I searched online for information about camping culture in the United States. It turned out that millions of Americans go camping every year. Families, friends, and coworkers treat it as a way to disconnect from busy routines and reconnect with simple experiences. Researchers in psychology often mention that spending time in nature reduces stress levels and improves mental clarity. Forest environments, fresh air, and natural sounds help the brain relax. That idea made sense. Life in the city had been busy and mentally demanding. Maybe a quiet forest weekend could be refreshing. Still, one part of my mind remained skeptical. At home that night, I stood in the kitchen looking at my phone again. The camping invitation still waited there. Accept. Or decline. My brain tried one more time to imagine possible embarrassment. What if I misunderstood instructions? What if I packed the wrong things? What if people spoke too quickly? Then another thought appeared. What if it turns out to be a great experience? Sometimes the difference between fear and curiosity is just a small shift in perspective. Language teachers often encourage students to practice English through real-life situations. Conversations during shared experiences create stronger memory connections than traditional classroom learning. In other words, experiences teach language in ways textbooks cannot. Camping might become one of those experiences. I opened the message again and started typing. My fingers paused for a second. Then I finished the sentence. Okay. I'll come with you. I pressed send. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a reply appeared. Awesome. It's going to be a great trip. A strange mixture of excitement and nervousness filled my mind. I had just agreed to something completely new. A weekend in the forest. With coworkers. Speaking English. Sleeping in a tent. Part of me wondered if I had made a mistake. But another part of me felt something different. Curiosity. The kind of curiosity that appears right before an adventure begins. At that moment, I didn't know it yet. But that small decision would soon take me far away from city lights, deep into a quiet American forest. And that forest would teach me something important about fear, confidence, and learning English in real life. Preparing for something I didn't understand. After I sent the message saying I would join the camping trip, a strange mix of excitement and nervous energy followed me for the next few days. Agreeing to the trip had been easy. Preparing for it was something else. Camping was completely new to me. In my home country, spending the night in a forest was not a common weekend activity. People enjoyed nature, of course, but sleeping outdoors in a tent was something I had mostly seen in movies or travel videos. Now suddenly, it was part of my weekend plan. Friday evening after work, Mark walked over to my desk again. Ready for tomorrow? He asked casually. I laughed a little. I think so, but I'm not sure what I need. Mark nodded. That's normal. First camping trips always feel confusing. Then he started listing a few basic things. A sleeping bag. Warm clothes. A flashlight. And maybe snacks. He paused and added with a smile, and don't forget curiosity. Curiosity. That word sounded simple, but it felt surprisingly helpful. Later that night, I opened my laptop again. This time, instead of watching a normal English lesson, I searched for something different. First camping trip in America. Dozens of videos appeared. People setting up tents. Cooking simple meals over a fire. Walking near lakes and forests. Some videos even included slow explanations for beginners. Watching these clips helped me understand something interesting about American camping culture. It was not about survival or extreme adventure. Most people treated camping as a simple way to relax and spend time together. Friends talked. Families laughed. People told stories while sitting around a fire. It looked calm. Almost peaceful. Still, I wanted to be prepared, not only for the camping part, but also for the language part. So I decided to practice a few simple English phrases that might be useful during the trip. Nothing complicated. Just everyday sentences. For example, where should I put my tent? Do we cook here? Is it cold at night? Language learning experts often recommend preparing useful phrases before entering real conversations. When your brain already recognizes certain sentence patterns, it responds more confidently in real situations. So I practiced speaking slowly in my apartment. Where should I put my tent? Where should I put my tent? It felt a little funny talking to myself in the kitchen, but repetition helps the brain build automatic responses. Then I practiced another simple sentence. This is my first camping trip. That one felt very true. Meanwhile, my mind kept imagining what the forest might feel like. City life creates a very specific kind of environment. Streetlights remove most darkness. Cars create constant background noise. Buildings block the wind. Forests are different. The darkness is deeper. The sounds are unfamiliar. Some people find that peaceful. Others find it slightly intimidating. Psychologists say that human brains are naturally sensitive to unfamiliar nighttime sounds because our ancestors needed to detect danger in wild environments. Even though modern camping areas are safe, the brain sometimes reacts as if it is entering unknown territory. I wondered if I would sleep well, or if every small sound would wake me up. Saturday morning arrived sooner than expected. The sky was bright and clear, and the air felt fresh. Early autumn sunlight filled the streets, and people were already walking their dogs or jogging along the sidewalks. Mark and the others planned to pick me up at a parking lot near my apartment. I packed my small bag carefully. Warm jacket. Flashlight. Extra socks. Simple snacks. Before leaving, I looked around my apartment for a moment. It had slowly become a comfortable place during my months in America. A quiet space where I practiced English, watched videos, and thought about my new life. Now I was about to leave that comfort zone for something unfamiliar. Outside, a large car pulled into the parking lot. Mark leaned out the window and waved. "Ready for your first camping adventure?" I smiled nervously and placed my bag in the back seat. Inside the car were two other coworkers. They greeted me warmly, and the atmosphere felt friendly right away. One of them asked, "First time camping?" I nodded. "Yes. First time." They laughed in a supportive way. "Don't worry," one of them said. Everyone remembers their first camping trip. As the car began driving away from the city, I looked back at the buildings slowly disappearing behind us. Tall offices turned into smaller houses. Busy roads turned into quiet highways. The landscape outside the window changed gradually. Trees appeared more often. Hills replaced flat streets. The air looked clearer somehow. During the drive, the conversation inside the car flowed naturally. People talked about music, favorite foods, and funny memories from past trips. Sometimes I understood every word. Sometimes I caught only the main idea. But something surprising happened. Nobody seemed concerned about perfect English. The conversation moved slowly. People repeated things when necessary. They laughed often. It felt relaxed. At one point Mark turned slightly in his seat and asked me, "Are you excited?" I thought for a moment before answering. "Yes," I said honestly. "And a little scared." Mark laughed. "That's the perfect combination for a good adventure." As the car continued moving north, tall trees began appearing along both sides of the road. The forest was getting closer. And soon, I would experience something completely new. My first camping trip in the United States. But the most interesting part of this journey was not the forest itself. It was the quiet realization that sometimes fear disappears not because the situation becomes easy, but because you decide to walk toward it anyway. The long drive into the forest. The city slowly disappeared behind us. At first, the change was subtle. Tall buildings turned into smaller neighborhoods. Traffic lights became less frequent. The busy sound of the city faded into the background. Then the road opened into long stretches of highway. For the first time since arriving in the United States, I truly noticed how big the country felt. On both sides of the road, trees stretched across rolling hills. The leaves were already beginning to change colors. Some were deep orange, some bright yellow, and others still held the last shades of summer green. Autumn in America has a quiet beauty. The sky looked wider outside the city. The air seemed clearer. Even the sunlight felt softer as it reflected off the forests. Inside the car, the atmosphere was relaxed. Music played quietly from the speakers. My coworkers talked casually about previous camping trips. They told stories about getting lost on hiking trails, cooking food over small campfires, and once accidentally forgetting a tent pole. Everyone laughed. Listening to their stories helped me realize something important about American outdoor culture. Camping was not about being perfect. It was about enjoying the experience. One of my coworkers, Sarah, turned around slightly from the front seat and asked me, "So what do you expect your first camping trip to be like?" I thought for a moment before answering. "Maybe a little scary," I said honestly. Everyone in the car laughed. Mark nodded. "That's normal." Then he added something interesting. "The first time always feels strange. But after that, you start noticing the peaceful parts." Peaceful parts. That idea stayed in my mind while I watched the forest passing outside the window. For many people who grow up in large cities, quiet natural environments can feel unfamiliar at first. Scientists who study environmental psychology explain that human brains are used to constant stimulation in urban spaces, traffic, lights, voices, movement. Nature offers something different. Less noise. Less speed. More space to think. At first, that quiet can feel uncomfortable. But eventually it becomes relaxing. The highway gradually turned into a smaller road. The road curved gently through wooded areas, and the number of cars became smaller and smaller. The deeper we drove into the forest region, the more the landscape changed. Tall pine trees appeared along the roadside. Small wooden cabins were scattered between the trees. Occasionally we passed a quiet lake reflecting the blue sky above it. It looked almost like a scene from a movie. I pressed my forehead lightly against the car window and watched the view. Back home, nature looked different. The forests had different shapes, the air carried different smells, and the sounds of animals and insects were unique. This American forest felt new to my senses. Another thing caught my attention. The conversation inside the car continued naturally, and slowly I felt more comfortable participating. At one point Sarah asked, "Do people go camping in your home country?" I explained slowly. "Some people visit nature parks, but sleeping in a tent is not very common where I grew up." "That makes this trip even more special," she said with a smile. Moments like that helped me feel included. Language learning researchers often emphasize that real conversations are the most powerful teachers. When people speak naturally in a friendly environment, the brain learns vocabulary, pronunciation, and rhythm at the same time. Without realizing it, I was practicing English in a very real situation. No classroom. No textbook. Just conversation during a road trip. After about an hour, Mark pointed ahead through the windshield. "Look over there." In the distance, a large lake appeared between the trees. Sunlight reflected off the surface of the water like thousands of small mirrors. "That's the lake near our campsite," he explained. The car slowed as we turned onto a narrow dirt road. The tires made a soft crunching sound on the gravel. Trees surrounded us now on every side. Tall trunks stretched upward, and branches formed a green ceiling above the road. Sunlight filtered through the leaves in small golden patches. The air outside looked calm. Almost silent. For a moment, I felt a small wave of nervousness again. The city was far away now. No tall buildings. No busy streets. Just forest. My brain quietly remembered all the concerns I had imagined earlier. Strange sounds at night. Darkness between the trees. Sleeping in a tent. But at the same time, another feeling appeared. Curiosity. Sometimes curiosity is stronger than fear. The car finally stopped in a small open area surrounded by trees. A wooden sign nearby marked the entrance to the campsite. Mark turned off the engine and stretched his arms. "Well," he said cheerfully, "we made it." Everyone opened their doors and stepped out of the car. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Fresh pine. Cool air. And the faint scent of earth and leaves. The forest was quieter than the city, but it was not completely silent. Birds called somewhere high in the branches. Leaves moved softly in the wind. A distant splash suggested fish moving in the lake. It felt alive. I stood there for a moment, taking in the scene. This was it. My first real camping experience in the United States was about to begin. At that moment, I did not know that the most memorable part of this trip would not be the forest, the lake, or even the night sky. It would be something much simpler. A few small conversations. A warm campfire. And a moment later that night that would challenge my fear in a way I never expected. My first night in a tent. Standing in the middle of that quiet forest clearing, I realized something simple but powerful. There was no turning back now. The car was parked, the bags were out, and everyone was already walking around the campsite choosing where to set up their tents. The forest surrounded us in every direction, tall trees swaying gently in the cool afternoon wind. Sunlight filtered through the branches, creating soft patterns on the ground. It looked peaceful. But inside my mind, a small voice whispered, "This is really happening." Mark clapped his hands together once and said cheerfully, "All right, let's set up the tents before it gets darker." Everyone grabbed their gear. I opened my bag and looked at the folded tent Mark had lent me for the trip. I had watched a few online videos about how to set up a tent, but doing it in real life felt slightly more complicated. Poles, fabric, hooks, and zippers suddenly looked like parts of a puzzle. Sarah noticed my hesitation and walked over. "First time setting up a tent?" she asked kindly. I nodded. "Yes, first time." She smiled. "Don't worry. I'll show you." One interesting thing about camping culture in the United States is how naturally people help each other. Even experienced campers expect beginners to make mistakes. Nobody seemed impatient. Within a few minutes, Sarah explained the basic steps. First we spread the tent flat. Then we connect the poles. After that we lift the frame. Her instructions were simple, and she spoke slowly enough for me to follow. While working, we talked casually. "This area is good for beginners," she said. "There are hiking trails nearby and the lake is great for fishing." I practiced a simple sentence I had repeated in my apartment the night before. "This is my first camping trip." She laughed warmly. "That makes it memorable." Soon the tent was standing. A small blue shelter between the tall trees. Looking at it gave me a surprising feeling of accomplishment. Something that seemed difficult only an hour earlier had become possible with a little help and patience. Language learning experts often explain that confidence grows in the same way. Small successful experiences slowly teach the brain that challenges are manageable. Setting up that tent felt like a small victory. As the afternoon continued, the campsite slowly came to life. Mark collected firewood. Another coworker prepared a small portable stove. Someone set up folding chairs around a circular fire pit. The atmosphere was relaxed and cooperative. Everyone moved naturally between tasks, talking and joking along the way. One of the most surprising things for me was how slowly conversations happened in this environment. In the city, people often speak quickly because they are moving between tasks. Here, there was no rush. Sentences were shorter. Pauses were longer. That made listening much easier. We cooked a simple dinner together, grilled vegetables, sandwiches, and hot soup. The smell of food mixed with the fresh forest air, creating a comforting atmosphere. As the sun began to lower behind the trees, the temperature dropped slightly. Mark lit the campfire. The first sparks appeared, then small flames slowly grew between the pieces of wood. Soon the fire was glowing warmly in the center of the campsite. Everyone gathered around it. There is something timeless about sitting near a campfire. Humans have done it for thousands of years. Anthropologists often say that fire naturally encourages storytelling and conversation. And that is exactly what happened. People began sharing small stories. Funny moments from previous camping trips. Embarrassing mistakes during hikes. Unexpected encounters with wildlife. The firelight flickered across their faces as they spoke, and the forest around us slowly grew darker. For a while, I simply listened. Listening carefully is one of the best ways to improve language understanding. Without pressure to speak, the brain absorbs pronunciation, tone, and vocabulary naturally. Occasionally someone asked me a question, and I answered in simple English. Nothing complicated. Just real conversation. As night continued to fall, the forest changed. During the day, the woods felt open and bright. At night, the trees became tall dark shapes against the sky. The sounds changed too. Instead of birds, I heard insects, distant rustling leaves, and the quiet movement of wind through branches. At first, those sounds made me slightly nervous. The human brain is naturally alert in unfamiliar nighttime environments. Our senses become sharper when visibility is low. But something interesting happened as I continued sitting by the fire. The sounds slowly became familiar. The rustling of leaves became rhythmic. The wind sounded gentle instead of threatening. The darkness felt calm instead of frightening. Eventually, people began preparing to sleep. The fire was reduced to glowing embers. Flashlights appeared. Tents zipped closed one by one. When I stepped into my tent, the cool night air followed me briefly before the zipper sealed the entrance. Inside the tent, everything felt surprisingly quiet. I lay inside my sleeping bag, staring at the faint outline of the tent fabric above me. Outside, the forest continued its quiet nighttime conversation. Wind. Leaves. Distant water from the lake. For a few minutes, my mind replayed the events of the day. The road trip. Setting up the tent. The campfire stories. Something unexpected had already happened. The fear I had imagined earlier was slowly becoming curiosity. But the night in the forest was not finished yet. Because later, when the campsite was completely silent, I would hear something outside my tent that would suddenly bring all my fears rushing back. And in that moment, I would have to decide how to face it. Campfire Conversations. Before everyone went to sleep that night, something simple but memorable happened around the campfire. It began quietly. The fire had already been burning for a while. The flames were no longer tall and bright like when Mark first lit the wood. Now they moved slowly, glowing orange and red, sending small sparks into the cool night air. The forest around us had grown darker, but the circle of firelight created a small island of warmth and comfort. We sat on folding chairs, wrapped in light jackets, holding warm cups of soup and tea. For a few minutes, nobody spoke. And strangely, the silence did not feel awkward. In the city, silence between people can feel uncomfortable. Many conversations rush to fill every empty moment. But in nature, silence feels different. It feels natural. The fire cracked softly as the wood shifted. Somewhere deeper in the forest, an owl called once, then disappeared again into the night. Finally, Mark leaned back in his chair and smiled. "This is my favorite part of camping," he said. Sarah nodded. Same. No phones, no emails, just stories. The conversation began slowly after that. One person shared a story about getting lost during a hiking trip in Colorado. Another talked about a fishing trip where they accidentally dropped their lunch into the lake. Everyone laughed. The atmosphere was relaxed and warm. For me, this moment felt important in another way. It was the first time since arriving in the United States that I felt completely comfortable participating in a long English conversation. At work, conversations often moved quickly. People were busy, and discussions jumped between topics rapidly. Here, the pace felt different. Slower. More thoughtful. Language researchers often explain that when conversations slow down, language learners have more time to process meaning and prepare responses. The brain can recognize patterns, connect vocabulary, and respond more confidently. Without realizing it, I was practicing English in one of the most natural environments possible. Real people. Real emotions. Real stories. At one point, Sarah looked at me across the fire. So, she said with a friendly smile, what surprised you the most about living in America so far? It was a simple question, but it made me think carefully. Many things had surprised me since moving here. The size of the country. The variety of landscapes. The friendliness of strangers in small conversations. But the answer that came to my mind was something different. The space, I said slowly. Space? Mark asked. Yes, I explained. Everything feels bigger. The roads. The forests. The sky. They nodded. That's true, Mark said. You notice that when you travel. I continued speaking, choosing my words carefully. In my home country, cities are closer together. Here, sometimes you drive for hours and see only trees. Everyone laughed again. That's America, Sarah said. The conversation moved to other topics after that. Favorite foods. Travel stories. Funny childhood memories. Sometimes I spoke. Sometimes I simply listened. Both felt valuable. Psychologists often explain that storytelling plays a powerful role in human connection. When people share personal experiences, listeners naturally feel more engaged and emotionally connected. Campfires have been a traditional place for storytelling for thousands of years. Long before smartphones or television, people gathered around firelight to share experiences, teach lessons, and build relationships. In that moment, sitting beside the glowing fire, I felt connected to that tradition in a small way. Even though my English was still improving, the conversation felt natural. Nobody expected perfect grammar. Nobody corrected small mistakes. People simply listened. And that made speaking easier. At one point Mark looked toward the dark forest surrounding our campsite. Listen, he said quietly. We all paused. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. The forest responded with its own quiet language. Wind moving through leaves. Insects creating a steady rhythm. The faint splash of water somewhere near the lake. It's peaceful, Sarah said softly. I nodded. Yes. Very peaceful. And it truly was. Earlier that day, I had imagined the forest as a place full of unknown dangers. Now it felt calm. Almost welcoming. Eventually the fire began shrinking into glowing red embers. One by one, people stood up, stretching their legs and preparing for sleep. Flashlights clicked on. Tents rustled as sleeping bags were arranged. The campsite slowly became quiet again. Before leaving the fire, Mark added one last piece of wood. The flames rose briefly, lighting the surrounding trees with warm orange light. "Good night, everyone," he said. "Good night," we replied. I walked back toward my tent, the beam of my flashlight guiding my steps along the ground. The forest felt darker now, but somehow less frightening than before. Inside the tent, I zipped the entrance closed and settled into my sleeping bag. The warmth of the campfire still lingered in my thoughts. The conversations. The laughter. The slow English stories. For the first time since arriving in America, speaking English felt less like a test and more like a shared experience. But the night still had one more surprise waiting. Because sometime after midnight, when the campsite had fallen completely silent, a strange sound outside my tent would suddenly wake me up. And that moment would test whether my fear of the forest had truly disappeared. The moment I faced my fear. Sometime deep in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. At first, I did not know why. The inside of the tent was dark and quiet. My sleeping bag was warm, and for a moment I thought maybe I had simply woken up by accident. Then I heard it again. A soft sound outside. Not loud, but clear enough to make my mind alert. It sounded like something moving through dry leaves. Slow. Careful. Crunch, pause, crunch. My eyes opened wider in the darkness. When people sleep in cities, nighttime sounds usually come from traffic, distant voices, or passing cars. The brain becomes used to those patterns. But in a forest, the sounds are completely different. Wind through branches. Small animals moving across the ground. Leaves shifting softly under unseen footsteps. Psychologists often explain that the human brain becomes more sensitive to unfamiliar sounds in dark environments. When visibility is low, the mind automatically prepares for possible danger. My heart began beating faster. For a few seconds I stayed completely still, listening. The sound came again. Crunch. Then silence. My brain immediately began imagining possibilities. Maybe it was just the wind. Maybe it was a small animal. Or maybe something bigger. Earlier that evening, Mark had joked about people hearing noises in the forest and thinking it was a bear. That memory suddenly returned to my mind at the worst possible moment. Of course, rationally I knew the campsite was considered safe. Park areas like this are usually monitored, and dangerous wildlife rarely approaches groups of people. But fear does not always follow logic. Fear follows imagination. Inside the tent, the darkness felt deeper. I could hear the faint breathing of the forest outside. Leaves moving, branches shifting, insects humming quietly. The sound came again. This time slightly closer. Crunch, crunch. For a moment I considered ignoring it. Pull the sleeping bag higher. Close my eyes. Pretend nothing was happening. But curiosity and fear together can be powerful motivators. My brain began asking questions. What if something is near the tents? What if it's harmless but interesting? Or what if my imagination is simply exaggerating a normal forest sound? Neuroscientists often say that facing small fears can help retrain the brain. When we safely investigate something that seems frightening, the mind slowly learns that the threat was not as serious as it imagined. Lying inside the tent, I remembered something Mark had said earlier that day. The first camping trip always feels strange. Maybe this was part of that experience. Slowly, I reached for my flashlight. The small metal cylinder felt cold in my hand. I hesitated. Opening the tent meant stepping into the darkness. The forest at night is very different from the forest during daylight. Shadows stretch longer. Shapes become less familiar. Every sound seems amplified. But staying inside the tent with my imagination running wild might be worse. I took a slow breath. Then another. Finally, I moved carefully toward the zipper. The sound of the zipper sliding open felt loud in the quiet night. Cool air entered the tent immediately. I leaned forward and looked outside. For a moment, the darkness looked almost solid. Then I turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the shadows, illuminating the ground near the tent. Leaves. Small stones. The roots of nearby trees. Nothing unusual. I slowly stepped outside. The night air felt cool on my face. Above the trees, the sky was filled with stars. Without city lights, the sky looked deeper and brighter than I had ever seen before. For a moment, I simply stood there, holding the flashlight and listening. The forest felt alive but calm. Then I heard the sound again. Crunch. This time the flashlight beam moved toward the source. Near a group of bushes, something small moved quickly across the ground. Not a bear. Not anything dangerous. Just a raccoon. The small animal paused briefly, looked toward the light, then disappeared quietly into the darkness between the trees. I laughed softly to myself. All that fear, for a raccoon. Standing there in the quiet forest, I realized something important. Most of the fear earlier had not come from reality. It came from imagination. Our brains often create large stories around small unknown sounds. But once we shine a light on the situation, the story becomes much simpler. I turned off the flashlight for a moment and looked up at the sky. The stars seemed endless. The forest breathed slowly around me. In that peaceful moment, something shifted inside my mind. The forest no longer felt threatening. It felt calm. Almost comforting. I zipped the tent closed again and returned to my sleeping bag. This time, when I closed my eyes, the sounds outside felt different. They were no longer warnings. They were simply the quiet language of the forest at night. And without realizing it, I had just taken the first real step toward overcoming a fear that had followed me much longer than this camping trip. But the most meaningful moment of this journey would not happen in the darkness. It would arrive the next morning, beside the lake, during a quiet conversation that would change my life in a completely unexpected way. The morning that changed everything. Morning arrived slowly in the forest. At first, it was just a faint gray light filtering through the fabric of the tent. The darkness that had surrounded the campsite during the night began to soften. I opened my eyes and lay still for a moment. The sounds of the forest were different now. Instead of mysterious movements in the darkness, there were birds calling from the trees. Somewhere nearby, water moved gently against the shore of the lake. The world felt calm again. For a few seconds, I remembered the moment from the night before, the sound outside the tent, the rush of fear, and the quiet relief when the flashlight revealed a small raccoon. It seemed almost funny now. But at the time, it had felt very real. Fear often feels powerful in the moment, especially when the mind begins creating stories around things it does not fully understand. Psychologists say that nighttime environments can intensify emotional reactions because the brain naturally becomes more alert when vision is limited. That simple instinct has helped humans survive for thousands of years. Still, once daylight arrives, many of those imagined dangers disappear. I stretched inside the sleeping bag and listened to the sounds outside. Someone nearby was already awake. A few seconds later, I heard the familiar voice of Mark. "You're finally awake." I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The morning air felt cool and fresh. A thin layer of mist floated above the lake, and sunlight was beginning to break through the trees on the far side of the water. It was one of the most peaceful scenes I had ever seen. Mark stood near the small camping stove, heating water for coffee. "You survived your first night," he said with a small smile. I laughed. "Barely." He raised an eyebrow. Oh. So I told him about the sound outside the tent. The footsteps in the leaves. The moment I thought it might be something dangerous. And the raccoon that had caused all the excitement. Mark listened quietly, then nodded. That happens to almost everyone their first time camping. He handed me a cup of coffee. When the environment is unfamiliar, the brain goes into detection mode. The warm cup felt good in my hands as I watched the mist slowly lifting off the lake. What do you mean? I asked. Mark sat down on a nearby log. Our minds are incredible pattern detectors, he explained. When something is unfamiliar, the brain starts scanning for possible threats. That's why small sounds feel bigger at night. The explanation made sense. Last night, the forest had felt mysterious and unpredictable. But now, with sunlight moving through the trees, everything looked open and peaceful. Mark took a sip of his coffee. The interesting thing, he continued, is that most fears work the same way. I looked toward the lake. How so? When we avoid something long enough, he said, our imagination fills in the gaps. The unknown becomes bigger than the reality. His words reminded me of something. For years, I had avoided camping. I had always imagined it as uncomfortable, dangerous, or stressful. But in reality, the experience had been far simpler. Yes, there were moments of uncertainty. But there were also moments of quiet beauty that I had never experienced before. The reflection of stars above the trees. The sound of the forest breathing at night. The peaceful silence of morning beside the lake. Mark pointed toward the water. Walk down there for a minute. I followed the path toward the lake. The ground was slightly damp with morning dew, and the air smelled clean and fresh. When I reached the shore, I stopped. The surface of the lake looked like glass. Mountains and trees reflected perfectly in the still water. For a moment, everything was quiet. Standing there, I realized something important. For years, I had avoided this kind of experience because of imagined discomfort. But now, in this simple moment beside the lake, the world felt wider. More peaceful. More real. Fear often convinces people to stay inside familiar environments. Inside routines. Inside comfort zones. But outside those boundaries, there are experiences waiting that the mind cannot fully imagine until they happen. When I returned to the campsite, Mark was packing some of the gear. So, he asked casually, would you ever go camping again? I paused for a moment. Then I smiled. Yeah, I said. I think I would. He laughed. That's usually how it starts. For many people, the first camping trip becomes the beginning of a completely new relationship with nature. Not because the experience is perfect, but because it reminds us how capable we are of adapting to unfamiliar situations. Sometimes, all it takes is one night outside the routine of daily life to realize that many of our fears were never as large as they seemed. As we packed the tents and prepared to leave the campsite, the forest looked different from the way it had felt the night before. It no longer seemed mysterious or intimidating. It felt welcoming. And that small shift in perspective was something I carried with me long after the trip ended. Because the lesson from that night was simple. Most fears grow stronger in the dark. But once we step forward and shine a little light on them, we often discover they were much smaller than we imagined. And sometimes, the moment we face them becomes the beginning of a completely new story. The lesson I carried home. The drive back from the campsite felt different from the drive there. When we first left the city the day before, my mind had been full of questions. I wondered if camping would be uncomfortable, boring, or even a little frightening. Now, as the car moved along the quiet highway, the forest slowly fading behind us, those thoughts had changed. Instead of uncertainty, there was a strange feeling of calm. The experience had been simple. Just one night in nature, a tent beside a lake, and a few quiet conversations under the stars. Yet something about that short trip had shifted the way I thought about fear. Many people imagine that overcoming fear requires a huge, dramatic moment. They picture extreme challenges, dangerous adventures, or intense situations. But sometimes the most meaningful changes happen in small, quiet experiences. Like stepping out of a tent in the middle of the night. Like realizing that the mysterious sound outside was only a raccoon moving through the leaves. Or like standing beside a lake at sunrise and noticing how peaceful the world can feel when the mind finally relaxes. Psychologists often talk about something called exposure. It is a simple idea. When we slowly face the things that make us uncomfortable, the brain begins to understand that those situations are not as threatening as it once believed. Over time, the fear becomes smaller. The brain learns a new pattern. That is exactly what happened during that camping trip. For years, my imagination had created an exaggerated picture of what camping might be like. Cold nights. Strange noises. Dangerous wildlife. But the real experience was very different. Yes, there were sounds in the forest. Yes, the darkness felt unfamiliar at first. But those moments were temporary. And once my mind adjusted to the environment, something surprising happened. The forest started to feel peaceful instead of intimidating. That shift did not happen because the forest changed. It happened because my perception changed. Fear often works that way. It grows larger when we avoid it. It grows smaller when we gently face it. As the city skyline appeared in the distance, traffic slowly becoming heavier again, I thought about how many other fears in life follow the same pattern. Fear of trying something new. Fear of leaving a comfortable routine. Fear of stepping into unfamiliar environments. These fears can quietly limit the experiences we allow ourselves to have. But the truth is, most of the time the situation itself is not the problem. The problem is the story our mind creates before we even try. That story becomes so convincing that we believe it completely. Until one day we test it. And reality turns out to be far less dramatic. Back at home, I unpacked my small camping bag. The tent still smelled faintly like pine trees and cool night air. It was strange how such a short trip could leave a lasting impression. Later that evening, while sitting at my desk, I looked through the photos I had taken. The lake at sunrise. The tall trees surrounding the campsite. The clear sky filled with stars. Each picture reminded me of a simple truth. Some of the most beautiful moments in life exist just outside our comfort zones. But we rarely see them if we never take the first step. That night in the forest did not magically remove every fear from my life. Fear is a natural part of being human. It protects us, warns us, and helps us stay alert in uncertain situations. But the experience changed something important. It reminded me that fear does not always deserve the final decision. Sometimes curiosity should lead instead. Sometimes it is worth stepping outside the tent, shining a light into the darkness, and discovering what is really there. More often than not, the unknown turns out to be far less threatening than our imagination predicted. And occasionally, it reveals something even better. A quiet lake at sunrise. A peaceful moment beneath a sky full of stars. Or a new confidence that grows each time we face something we once avoided. Since that first camping trip, I have returned to the forest many times. Each visit feels a little more familiar. The sounds at night no longer feel mysterious. The darkness no longer feels intimidating. Instead, those same sounds have become part of a calm rhythm that belongs to the natural world. Looking back, the most important part of the trip was not the raccoon outside the tent. It was the decision to open the zipper, step outside, and face the moment instead of hiding from it. That simple action changed the story in my mind. And sometimes, changing the story is the first step toward changing an entire perspective. So if there is something in your life that feels unfamiliar or slightly intimidating, remember this. Fear often grows strongest in the imagination. But once you move toward it, even in a small way, the truth usually becomes much clearer. And on the other side of that moment, you might discover an experience that becomes one of your favorite memories. Why fear feels so real. Long after that first camping trip ended, one question stayed in my mind. Why had the fear felt so real that night? Logically, I knew the campsite was safe. Mark had camped there many times before. The area was known for being calm and well-maintained. Yet when I heard those soft footsteps outside the tent, my heart immediately started racing. My imagination filled the darkness with possibilities. For a few moments, the fear felt completely convincing. The answer to that question lies deep inside the human brain. For thousands of years, our ancestors survived because they reacted quickly to possible danger. When something moved in the dark, it was safer to assume it might be a threat. If the brain guessed wrong and reacted too strongly, nothing serious happened. But if the brain ignored a real threat, the consequences could be much worse. Because of that history, the human mind developed a system designed to detect potential danger extremely fast. That system is powerful. And sometimes, it is a little too powerful. Scientists often describe the brain as having two different response systems. The first system reacts instantly. It does not wait for full information. It simply asks one urgent question. Could this be dangerous? If the answer might be yes, the body reacts immediately. The heart beats faster. Breathing becomes quicker. Muscles tighten slightly. The body prepares for action before the conscious mind even understands what is happening. That is exactly what I experienced in the tent that night. Before I had time to think clearly, my body was already reacting. The sound in the leaves might have been harmless. But the brain preferred to prepare for danger just in case. The second system in the brain works differently. This system is slower, more analytical. It gathers information. It observes the situation. Then it begins asking logical questions. Where is the sound coming from? How close is it? Does it match the behavior of something dangerous? The problem is that the first system often activates much faster than the second one. So in dark or unfamiliar environments, the emotional response arrives before logical reasoning has time to catch up. That delay can make fear feel incredibly convincing. When I stepped outside the tent and turned on the flashlight, the second system finally had enough information to take control. The raccoon became visible. The situation became clear. And almost instantly, the fear disappeared. Nothing about the forest had changed. Only the information available to my brain had changed. This pattern appears in many areas of life. Public speaking. Trying a new career path. Traveling somewhere unfamiliar. Meeting new people. In each situation, the brain sometimes reacts with the same ancient alarm system. It senses uncertainty. It senses unpredictability. And it quickly prepares the body for possible danger. But modern life rarely involves the same threats our ancestors faced thousands of years ago. Instead, the brain is often reacting to social situations, new experiences, or unfamiliar environments. Situations that feel risky emotionally but are actually quite safe. That is why facing small fears can be so powerful. Each time we experience something unfamiliar and realize we are safe, the brain updates its understanding of the world. The next time we encounter a similar situation, the reaction becomes weaker. The fear becomes smaller. confidence grows quietly in the background. This process is sometimes called fear recalibration. It happens slowly, one experience at a time. The camping trip was a perfect example. At the beginning of the night, every sound in the forest felt mysterious. Every movement in the leaves triggered curiosity mixed with caution. But by the end of the night, the same environment felt peaceful. My brain had gathered new information. The forest was no longer an unknown place. It had become a familiar one. Even the sounds at night had changed meaning. Instead of warnings, they became part of the natural rhythm of the forest. Looking back now, I realize that the raccoon outside the tent was never the real challenge. The real challenge was the story my mind created in the darkness. That story grew quickly because the brain hates uncertainty. When we cannot see clearly, the mind fills the gaps with imagination. Sometimes those imagined scenarios become much bigger than reality. But the moment we gather real information, the story changes. That is why curiosity is such a powerful response to fear. Curiosity encourages us to investigate instead of retreat. To observe instead of assume. To learn instead of imagine. When curiosity leads the way, fear often loses much of its strength. That lesson from the forest became useful in many other parts of life. Whenever a new situation feels intimidating, I remember that night beside the lake. The quiet darkness. The cautious step outside the tent. The flashlight beam moving across the ground. And the small raccoon disappearing into the trees. It reminds me that fear often begins with uncertainty. But clarity usually arrives once we look a little closer. And sometimes, the moment we decide to investigate instead of avoid becomes the moment our confidence begins to grow. The quiet confidence that followed. Weeks passed after that first camping trip. Life slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Morning routines. Work schedules. Evenings spent at home. The familiar pace of daily life quietly filled the days again. At first, the camping experience felt like a small adventure that had already ended. Just a short trip to the forest. One night in a tent. A raccoon wandering through the leaves. But something subtle had changed inside my mind. It was not dramatic. There was no sudden transformation or moment where everything felt different. Instead, the change appeared quietly in everyday situations. One afternoon, I noticed it while thinking about trying something new. Normally, my first instinct in unfamiliar situations had always been hesitation. Questions would appear immediately. What if it doesn't go well? What if I'm not prepared? What if the situation becomes uncomfortable? Those thoughts used to arrive quickly and strongly. But this time, something else appeared alongside them. A memory. The quiet forest. The darkness outside the tent. The moment when imagination had created something far larger than reality. That memory brought a different question to mind. What if the situation is actually simpler than it seems? That small shift in thinking may sound minor. But it can make a huge difference in how people approach new experiences. Psychologists often explain that confidence does not come from eliminating fear completely. Instead, confidence grows when the mind learns that fear does not always control the outcome. Every time someone faces a small uncertainty and realizes they can handle it, the brain records that experience. Over time, those experiences slowly reshape the way we respond to future challenges. The camping trip had created one of those experiences. It showed me that unfamiliar environments were not automatically negative. They were simply new. And new situations often contain opportunities that routine environments cannot offer. The forest had taught that lesson quietly. There were no speeches. No dramatic events. Just simple moments. The reflection of stars on a lake. The sound of wind moving through trees. The realization that most nighttime noises belong to small animals continuing their normal routines. Even the moment of fear inside the tent had become valuable in hindsight. Because that moment had forced a choice. Stay inside and let imagination grow stronger. Or step outside and discover the truth. Choosing to investigate had changed the entire experience. And that same pattern began appearing in other areas of life. When a new opportunity appeared, the mind no longer reacted with immediate resistance. Instead, curiosity appeared more often. Maybe this is worth trying. Maybe the situation is not as complicated as it seems. Maybe the unknown is simply waiting to be understood. Curiosity does something interesting to fear. It shifts the focus. Instead of asking, what could go wrong? The mind begins asking, what might I discover? That change in perspective can transform many experiences. Traveling to a new place. Learning a new skill. Starting conversations with people we have never met before. Each of these situations contains uncertainty. But they also contain possibility. The challenge is that possibility only becomes visible once we move closer to the unknown. Avoiding the experience keeps everything hidden. That lesson became clearer the more I reflected on the camping trip. If I had refused the invitation from Mark, none of those moments would have happened. The peaceful lake at sunrise. The quiet laughter over coffee in the morning. The realization that the forest at night was far calmer than my imagination predicted. Sometimes a single decision opens the door to an entire chain of new experiences. And often, that first decision feels slightly uncomfortable. That is where growth begins. Comfort zones are useful. They provide stability and predictability. But they can also quietly limit the range of experiences we allow ourselves to have. Stepping beyond those boundaries does not require extreme actions. Often, it begins with something small. Trying a new activity. Visiting a new environment. Saying yes to an opportunity that feels slightly unfamiliar. Those small steps slowly expand the world around us. They introduce new perspectives. New skills. New confidence. Looking back now, the camping trip was not just about spending a night in nature. It was about learning how easily the mind can exaggerate uncertainty. And how quickly that uncertainty disappears once we experience reality directly. The forest had not changed overnight. The darkness had not become less mysterious. But my understanding of the situation had grown clearer. That clarity created a quiet confidence that continued long after the trip ended. It is the kind of confidence that does not need to be loud. It simply reminds you that unfamiliar situations are not always problems to avoid. Sometimes they are invitations. Invitations to explore. Invitations to learn. And occasionally, invitations to discover that the world outside our routines is far more welcoming than we once imagined. Looking back now, it's strange how such a small moment can change the way you see the world. It wasn't a dangerous situation. It wasn't an extreme adventure. It was simply a quiet night in the forest, and a sound in the leaves. Yet that moment revealed something important about the way our minds work. Most fears are not born from reality. They are born from uncertainty. When we cannot see clearly, the imagination fills the darkness with possibilities. And the longer we stay inside that uncertainty, the bigger those imagined threats can become. But the moment we move closer, the moment we look directly at what scares us, the story often changes. That night, the mysterious sound outside the tent felt enormous. My mind imagined something large, something dangerous, something unknown. But when the flashlight finally illuminated the ground, the truth was surprisingly simple. Just a raccoon. A small animal moving through dry leaves. The fear disappeared almost instantly. And in that quiet moment beside the forest, I realized something powerful. Fear loses much of its strength when curiosity takes the lead. That lesson extends far beyond camping. In life, many of the opportunities that shape us the most are hidden behind moments of hesitation. A new career path. A new place to explore. A new challenge that feels slightly uncomfortable at first. Our instinct is often to stay inside the familiar. Inside routines that feel predictable and safe. But the most memorable experiences rarely happen there. They exist just outside the comfort zone. Waiting for the moment when curiosity becomes stronger than hesitation. That single camping trip reminded me that growth doesn't always come from dramatic events. Sometimes it begins with something simple. Opening the zipper of a tent. Stepping outside into the darkness. Shining a small light into the unknown. And discovering that the world is far less frightening than our imagination suggested. If there is one idea I hope you carry from this story, it is this. The unknown is not always something to fear. Often, it is simply something we have not understood yet. And once we move toward it, even one small step at a time, we begin to see things more clearly. Sometimes we discover beauty where we expected danger. Sometimes we discover confidence where we expected doubt. And sometimes we discover that the stories we tell ourselves were never true in the first place. But here's something even more interesting. That camping trip was only the beginning. Not long after that night beside the lake, another experience happened, one that made the lesson from the forest feel even more real. It involved a place I never expected to visit, and a situation that challenged my comfort zone in a completely different way. And when it happened, the memory of that raccoon in the leaves suddenly came back to me. Because once you understand how fear works, you begin to notice it everywhere. And that realization can change the choices you make for the rest of your life. If stories like this make you think a little deeper about the way our minds work, you're in the right place. On this channel, we explore real-life experiences, psychology, personal growth, and the quiet lessons hidden inside everyday moments. Sometimes those lessons come from nature. Sometimes they come from unexpected encounters. And sometimes they come from situations that seem ordinary at first, but reveal something powerful when you look a little closer. So if you enjoy thoughtful stories that challenge the way we see fear, curiosity, and human behavior, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way, you won't miss the next story. Because the next one might make you look at your own fears in a completely new way. And before you go, I'd love to ask you something. Think about the last time you faced something that made you slightly uncomfortable, and discovered it wasn't as scary as you expected. What happened? Share your experience in the comments. Your story might help someone else take their first step into the unknown. And sometimes, that first step is all it takes to change everything.